Welcome to Spybrary, by spy fans, for spy fans, with your host, Spy Right's Jeff Quest.
Hi, my name is Jeff, and I'll be your host for this episode. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Adam Brookes to the podcast. Adam spent over a decade working for the BBC, appearing on television and radio while crisscrossing the globe and spending an extended amount of time in both China and the US. He's also written for publications such as Foreign Policy and The Economist. His first espionage novel, Night Heron, was released in 2014 and was followed by Spy Games and The Spy's Daughter. His most recent book is Fragile Cargo, China's Wartime Race to Save the Treasures of the Forbidden City, currently out in the UK and releasing February 14th in the US. Adam, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
So before we get into your books, I was hoping to talk a little bit about your beginnings. You had a whole other career as a journalist in China and the US before becoming a novelist. And whatever the term is for a nonfiction writer, is it just writer? But I was wondering what led you down that path initially?
Well, it was one of those things I sort of drifted into, having failed to do any of the careers that I really wanted. I studied Chinese at university in the 1980s, and that was in the UK. Not many people did that at the time. And it was something that journalism, news organizations were very interested in, because that was a time when China was just beginning to open up a little bit. So I found myself kind of drifting into journalism in my mid-20s. And then I was fortunate enough to get a job at the BBC as a very junior newsroom journalist. And from there, I went on to become a foreign correspondent and ended up covering China for a protracted period. So the China thing has been with me really. I've been trying to pay attention to China since I was about 19, 20 years old. And that's sort of shaped everything in my so-called career, really.
Sure. And as a reporter, I know you were a part of the press gaggle that reported on former President George W. Bush's trip to Asia. You've interviewed the Dalai Lama. You reported about bin Laden's death, among many other things. And I was just wondering, what's it like covering such high-profile events?
It was great. I mean, I had a terrific couple of decades with the BBC, and being a foreign correspondent for a major news organization at a time when news organizations were riding high. Today, many of them find themselves challenged financially in a way that 10 years ago they were not. And it was great. One would report breaking news on a day-to-day basis from Beijing or from Washington, D.C., but frequently when huge global stories broke, the BBC would reach out and say, get on a plane to wherever, and off you would go. The day after 9/11, I was on a plane to Pakistan. I covered parts of the invasion of Iraq and its aftermath, and volcanic eruptions in the Philippines and earthquakes in Taiwan, and an awful lot of politics and particularly defense and security stuff in the United States. I covered the Pentagon for 2 years. And that kind of pushed me towards trying to develop an understanding of how the modern security state really works. In China and in Indonesia and other Asian countries, I sort of got a sense of how their security states worked and the role that the national security state played in kind of the way power is deployed in those countries. And then I got to look at the way that it was deployed in the US as well, through the Pentagon, through the intelligence community, through the law enforcement arms. And I don't know, I just find that whole world very intriguing. We don't see much of it. And what we see of it, we don't really understand very well, because so much of it is secret. We sort of see it, one critic has written about what he calls the national security sublime, that there is this huge national security state out there that we're kind of dimly aware of, but we only ever kind of perceive it on an aesthetic level. We don't ever really understand how it works. We only see the military and intelligence agencies, the agencies of power and organized violence, through movies and through stories. We don't ever really, unless we go to work for them, we don't ever really see what they're like, what they're about. And so as a journalist, I became slightly obsessed, is the word, with trying to figure out some of the mechanics of some of those systems, and I was particularly interested in the intelligence agencies. Yeah.
Well, and you were a reporter for many years. You had what seems like a great assignment in Washington. So I guess the question is, why become a novelist? Probably just for that big money, the big payday, right?
That obviously was the main reason. The 22, 23 years of being a foreign correspondent takes a bit of a toll. And particularly when you have a family and kids, it starts to get hard. It's a young person's game, really. So by my 40s, getting called up at 4 a.m. and told to go and cover a school shooting was getting old, to be honest with you. So I kind of decided to change. Well, I think I made a kind of subconscious decision to change my life. And so I quit the BBC and I tried to be a healthier, better person, tried to be more present for my family. And I thought I would like to take some of that material that I have gathered over the years about the national security state, and I'd like to use it in some way. And I played around with various nonfiction ideas relating to intelligence and power in the world today, and China particularly, and couldn't really find a story or a way of doing it that was going to work. So I decided to try writing fiction instead. And I've always been a huge admirer of the espionage genre in fiction writing. It's a terrific vehicle, and we can talk about that if you want to. But I thought, why not? I'm going to give it a go. So I did.
Yeah, that's great. Well, and you lead right into my next question, which is, what were some of your espionage influences?
Oh, all of them, same as everybody else's. You know, there aren't very many espionage writers, right? It's a very small genre. Le Carré, of course, right at the top of the list. Graham Greene. I'm a huge fan of Graham Greene's novels, so I must admit I haven't reread them in a long time. The early guys who defined the genre, Eric Ambler, Somerset Maugham. I'm a big admirer of Alan First, especially in his early novels, Dark Star, The Polish Officer, Dark Voyage. He has an economy of writing and an ability to build character and an ability to kind of run a subtext beneath the narrative that I just find completely compelling. I think he's a wonderful, wonderful writer and much underrated. I don't think people fully appreciate the power of that novel, Dark Star. The larger, wider thriller genre, I haven't kind of been so invested in. I kind of find a lot of thriller writing a bit, I don't know. I don't like thrillers that get written in the heroic mode. I'm not a big fan of the heroic mode in general. I like novels that lean towards the ironic and the realistic, which is why, of course, I love Le Carré and First and Green.
So since, you were a reporter in Asia for so many years, I'm curious what your opinion, I have to ask it, of the Honourable Schoolboy is, since that was Le Carré's kind of one, venture into that area.
Right, yes, the Asian spy novel. It's not been one that has been widely done at all. You're right, and of course, everybody has to live in the shadow of the Quiet American by Graham Greene. And Le Carré's Honourable Schoolboy is the stepchild of the Carla trilogy, isn't it? And he was very deft. Le Carré was very deft, I think, in not attempting a large take on Asian affairs or Asia in general. He doesn't really attempt to give you much of a China story, does he? It's all hint and allusion and guesswork, which I think works brilliantly, approaching China on any level, whether you're looking at policy analysis or you're trying to figure out how the leadership works. In real life, it really does rely on hints and guesswork and glimpses. And I think Le Carré captures that sense very well, particularly at a time when he was writing in the 1970s when China was so closed. So I like it. I really like the Honourable Schoolboy. I know he's come in for a lot of stick for his kind of Orientalist tropes and things, but I think scenes like the scene where the agent Phoebe is being debriefed in her room by the SIS operative Craw, whose cover is that of an Australian foreign correspondent, that is just one of the best set pieces, I think, in espionage writing. I think it's absolutely terrific. It absolutely crackles. It's just wonderful. And I think his portrayal of journalism was very good as well. I like the way that his journalists think. I like the way they kind of behave. I like his satire on the foreign correspondent as well. I love it. I love it. I think it's great. I love all Le Carré's books. Whatever, we all know the critiques of Le Carré and the problems that he's credited with having, but I love him.
Well, I'm with you on that. So
what do you think of it? What do you think?
I definitely think it's different from the two other bookends in the trilogy, and so you got to be ready for that. But there's still, it's great. I really enjoy that one as well. So I'd have a whole podcast about Le Carré. So you just get me going.
Oh, can I come on that one as well?
Yeah, please, be happy to have you.
I'm one of the world's great Le Carré bores. I can reduce people to tears.
All right. Well, we'll be crying when I get you on the podcast. Then that'll be great. But, you do lead to another point that I wanted to ask you about is, you write entertainingly about a reporter turned spy. But as somebody who was a reporter yourself, what are your feelings on that? Because I know it's been done before, especially in, World War II and the early Cold War. But as far as covers go, doesn't that idea put all reporters in danger? Similar to using a doctor as a spy.
Yeah, I wrestled with that for about 5 minutes, to be honest. I don't think there's always a question whether journalism has responsibilities to the real world and what those responsibilities are, and how far the reporter is bound to take into account the consequences of what they report. So, for example, when I was a foreign correspondent in China, I would be reporting stuff that was, could be perceived as quite damaging either to China or to the UK or to the United States. I was messing up the US-China relationship or the UK-China relationship. I was being disruptive and difficult. And I was constantly asked by people in China, why don't you consider that you have some sort of responsibility to helping to maintain a healthy UK-China relationship or a healthy US-China relationship? Why are you journalists so disruptive? Why do you report all this bad stuff that just makes everybody's lives harder? And diplomats, European and American diplomats would constantly get very frustrated with us because we would be messing around with their projects, essentially, and questioning what they did in China and why. What's the answer to those questions? As a UK reporter in China, do I have any kind of obligation to supporting and enabling the UK-China relationship? My answer would be no, I don't, frankly. Get lost. Similarly, does the novelist have any responsibility to real life? What is that contract? Does the novelist have any obligation to either mirror real life or to support particular networks of power and interest in real life or to undermine others? I don't really know what the answer to that is, but I think fiction does a whole lot of different things. And the espionage genre is about examining the nature of power in the world, ultimately. That's what it's about. It's about the nature of power, and it's about the nature of the contracts that we have with society and the people around us, and when we choose to betray those contracts. And journalists are, frankly, a pretty amoral bunch. Read Janet Malcolm, The Journalist and the Murderer. Journalists are aware that they're not up there with people in the world who prioritize doing lasting and visible good. Let's put it that way. So no, I didn't have any qualms really about writing a novel about a journalist who becomes a spy. And the truth is, these days, that idea that journalists shouldn't be spies, mustn't be spies, won't be spies is breaking down rapidly. And it has been for a while. And quite a lot of journalists are now spies. And the line between the journalist and the spy has muddied in recent years. And it's something we need to think about and we need to reckon with because it's a problem.
Well, and it also, I think that probably relates a little bit to the fact that more journalists are advocates versus pure reporters anymore. It feels like, it's become more that, reporters feel like they need to have a sense of, moral clarity when they're coming about whatever they're talking about versus reporting facts. I don't know, you might disagree with that, but I think that plays into the fact that, we need to pick a side kind of a thing.
I think that has certainly happened, and the internet has blurred, and contemporary politics have blurred all those lines, and the idea of impartiality in journalism is under real assault, and perhaps rightly so. Journalists were never that impartial. Most of us were always on the side of power, to be honest. Most news organizations are on the side of power. But I'm kind of talking about something different. I'm talking about the fact that intelligence agencies now use journalists in a way that they didn't 15 years ago. In the last 20 years, we've seen governments set up websites that pretend to be news websites that are not news websites. They're government propaganda websites. The US does this. It did it all the time, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan. China uses journalists regularly as intelligence operatives. We know which Chinese news organizations actually provide non-official cover to operatives of the Ministry of State Security. We know this. Xinhua News Agency, which purports to be China's news agency, has an intelligence gathering function. We know this. It's well established. Out in the freelance world, which has hugely proliferated since the advent of internet news sites and in the breakdown of major news organizations' capacity to pay for and support real foreign correspondents. We've had this explosion of freelancing in the last 10, 15 years. And a lot of these guys are kind of pretty sketchy, and they will be a journalist during the day and there'll be something else at night, whether it's an influencer or an access agent or a propagandist or a political campaigner, as you say. So the lines have got very mushy, and we live in an information world that is much less clean and well-defined than it used to be. And it never was that clean and well-defined, but it's much less so today. So novels and fiction and nonfiction need to start wrestling with this. They need to start thinking about these questions, and we need to start having a much more competent understanding of the information world that we live in. And that means taking a long, hard look at people who purport to be journalists today, because some of them ain't.
So shifting to China a little bit, I got to ask you, how hard is it to see news coming out of China and Hong Kong and not be there reporting it? Are you kind of glad to see that chapter close on your life?
Not hard at all. Being a reporter in China today it was always difficult, but today it's really difficult. And the degree to which foreign reporters are constrained in what they can do and where they can go and who they can talk to is far more acute than when I was there. And they have my endless and abiding respect for putting up with that level of crap that they have to deal with from the Chinese authorities. Surveillance of foreign reporters has always been big in China, but today reporters are being tailed by teams of 6 whenever they go to a city outside Beijing. They're being regularly harassed, they're bugged, they're intimidated, and they're lied to on the regular. And it's very, very difficult for them to function. So they, particularly on stories like Xinjiang and the fate of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. In Hong Kong, my heart just breaks, frankly, for writers and thinkers in Hong Kong facing this onslaught of repression from Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. So no, I'm happy to be out of that. I'm not sure I would have the heart, the will to be doing that right now. It's very, very difficult.
So, I grew up in Chicago, where we have a decades-long history with kind of autocratic leaders who are able to accomplish some extraordinary projects, but kind of crush any dissent. And so when I read about the politics of China work, it feels slightly familiar. For the layperson, how do you explain the political state of the country? And I know that's a big question, but for somebody who doesn't necessarily immerse themselves in that, how would you kind of explain what's going on in China?
Great question. That's been sort of the challenge of my career, really. It's the only thing I've sort of done is try to explain what goes on in China in ways that people can kind of get a handle on, get their arms around. And I haven't been successful at all, and neither has anybody else. China remains a bit of a black box for an English-speaking audience. People find it very alien, very hard to understand. There are a couple of basic ideas, I think, that if you keep them in mind, will help you get traction on events in China a bit. One of them is that this is a party state. The Chinese Communist Party is all-powerful in China. It has very deep roots in China. It's not just some authoritarian party that is imposed on society and rules by brute force. It's got much deeper intellectual, cultural roots than that. People really care about the Chinese Communist Party. Oftentimes they really hate it, makes them crazy, but they still really care about it. Uprooting or overthrowing the Chinese Communist Party would be extremely difficult. It has deep roots lodged deep in Chinese society. The second idea that flows from that is the party's aim and its central project is to maintain its own position in power. And all the things it does are calculated on the basis of that proposition. What must we do to maintain our position in power? Everything you see, economic growth, opening up, adopting a bit of capitalism, keeping on a bit of socialism, triangulating their way through a market economy and a planned economy, oppressing some people, giving others more freedom, whatever it may be, allowing the growth of a new popular culture, fostering traditional culture, new nationalism, aggressive diplomacy, reconciliatory diplomacy, threatening Taiwan, attacking Uyghurs. All these things come back to what do we need to do to maintain our historical position and our destiny, our historic role as the dominant power in China. And once you use that filter to kind of look at events in China, they kind of start making some more sense. They kind of start falling into place a little bit, I would argue. And the third thing to look at is geography. Just take a look at China's geographical position. And particularly if you want to understand China's strategic thinking, take a look at its geography. Why is it so insistent on maintaining absolute control in Xinjiang? Why is it so insistent on maintaining absolute control in Tibet? And why does it want Taiwan so badly? If you look at the strategic geography, it starts to make sense. China is surrounded in its interior by the Tibetan Plateau and all these deserts that give it strategic security and strategic stability. Yeah, China sees its strategic safety as dependent on controlling Tibet and Xinjiang. You've got to have all that territory in order to keep the center of China strategically safe and protect it from invasion. Similarly, Taiwan is one of all these islands, all these island archipelagos, the Chinese call it the first island chain, that run all the way around China's coastline. It's very difficult for China to dominate its maritime environment. Yeah, it feels constantly threatened from the sea. So what China's trying to do is dominate its maritime environment, and it wants to take Taiwan in order to be able to do that and to give it access to the Pacific. China's navy finds it very hard to maneuver, for example, right? Because you've got all these island chains, Indonesia, the Philippines, Taiwan, the Korean islands, everything. You're hemmed in all the time. So China feels very strategically vulnerable. Whether it feels that way rightly or wrongly, it does. They constantly see themselves under threat. And you can understand their aggressiveness and their military buildup and all this bellicose stuff through the filter of them feeling constantly strategically under threat. And if you do that, it starts to all make a bit more sense. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. In the US, there's a bit of a national panic about China. It reminds me of a bit of the hysteria in the 90s over Japan. You know, you had Michael Crichton's Rising Sun and all of this kind of stuff in the ether. And I would say you avoid the cliches and, frankly, the racism that has come with a lot of books that look at China. They're doing their job just like UK or American spies. You know, their country is just culturally very different and the power structure is dramatically different. Can you talk about your process to make them real people versus boogeymen?
Right. Well, thank you for saying that. You know, it's something that if you're going to write about a culture other than your own, you're always concerned about whether you're unconsciously falling into stereotype and, you know, silliness. Living in China for a long time, obviously you get to know people and you hear people's stories. I have extended family who are Chinese. So I've heard a lot of family stories, and I've heard them told in ways that are, you know, kind of, what's the word? Sort of intimate, I guess, that are tellings that are based on trust, you know? So you begin to hear stuff that perhaps you wouldn't normally get to hear from people. What happened to people, you know, during the communist takeover in the 1950s? What happened during the anti-rightist campaign? What happened to people in the Cultural Revolution? What happened to their marriages? What happened to their kids? The choices that they had to make. I find it very compelling. These stories are often very tragic, you know, they're really, really tragic. I had a relative, he's passed away now, but I had a relative who in the late 1950s was a student in Beijing. He said the wrong thing. He went down in the anti-rightist campaigns of the 50s. He ended up being sent off to a factory. He was a student in engineering. He was sent off to a factory where he had to sweep the floors for the next 7 years. And he got out from that sentence just in time for the Cultural Revolution to start, and spent another 20 years sweeping the same floors. He spent, more than a quarter of a century. The center of his adult life was spent sweeping floors in a factory. He was never able to marry. He was a rightist. He was untouchable until the early 1980s, when he was rehabilitated under the new post-Mao regime in China. And he went back to university and he got his degree and he got a PhD, in fact. And he went on to live his dream of becoming an engineer. And he lived out his life at the end of it all, in sort of some comfort. And he was haunted by his experiences. But the end of his life was okay. And that trajectory is a really, really common trajectory in China. People had an incredibly miserable time for quite a long time under Mao. And then post-Mao, the party turned on a dime and kind of made it better. And life got a whole lot better. And so when I talk about the deep roots that the party has, often they sort of live there. They live there in the fact that, it really did improve massively in the 80s and 90s. And those stories for me anyway, have sort of lent a insight, or certainly some empathy on my part, I think, for the way that Chinese people view their own lives and view the arc of their lives and what's happened to them. You're right. That sort of complexity and those stories don't get told very often in the English-speaking world. And we tend to see China as this huge, undifferentiated place, right? Just full of all these people we don't understand, doing things we don't understand. The way to get around that, I think, perhaps it may be ridiculously naive of me, but I think the way to get around that is through stories. It's through stories about people. And once you start hearing those stories and hearing about the lived experiences of Chinese people in the arc of their lives, then you start to get some kind of sense of what this country is and where it's come from and why it's doing the things that it's doing today. Maybe that's hopelessly kind of romantic idea, but it works for me.
Well, I'll take a few Pollyannas in the world over cynics any day. One of the other things that your fiction books do, is cover topics that are kind of on the cutting edge of real stories that you've been reading about in the news. In Chicago, we just had I think it was a student convicted of spying for China, a college student. Continue to see reports about, Chinese internment camps, theft of important intellectual property. How does it feel when you see, things that you're writing about in fiction become more and more reality?
Well, they were already happening when I was writing the fiction. And I've got to tell you, my first novel, Night Heron, which came out in 2014, when I look back at it now, it almost feels like it comes from an earlier time period. I mean, I think it still works as a novel, as a spy novel. But when you look at the actual issues that I was dealing with in that novel, they've kind of been overtaken by events somewhat. I think the last one, Spy's Daughter, which came out in 2017, still holds up in terms of the themes that it was dealing with and the technological themes that it was dealing with. I write about artificial consciousness and drone swarms in that novel as the kind of, the central plank of the plot, and the competition for strategic intellectual property, particularly around artificial intelligence. So yeah, that all kind of holds up. I think that's still happening. But this world is moving so quickly. And as a spy writer, you've got to be very careful with your technology, because it's all moving so fast that you just get, you get overtaken so quickly. In the end, spy novels, they need to be about people and about the themes of espionage rather than about the technology anyway, right? I don't know. How important is the technology to you when you read a spy novel? Do you like it? Does it matter?
I think the risk, as you said, is technology is ever changing. And so this year's drones could be next year's, something else. So I think that's the trick. Especially, I've read books from the 80s where, people are on their mainframe computers and doing that. But if you don't, you don't care about the people that are in the story, it doesn't hold up.
Yeah. Though, I mean, equally, actually, if the writer is good enough and the characters do hold up, it kind of doesn't matter if they're on the mainframe computers. And there is is a tendency among many contemporary spy writers to set their novels back in the Cold War, or at least in the 90s, before we all had mobile phones, because it's so much easier to run an espionage operation without mobile phones, right, and without facial recognition technology. So all spy writers have been really wrestling with, as indeed intelligence agencies are in real life, really wrestling with just how do you be a spy today in this era of technology with facial recognition and gait recognition and voice recognition? How do you build a cover? How do you do that? And I dealt a little bit with this in Night Heron, where my agent handler, Val Hopko, is speaking to her agent, who is a journalist who's been recruited by British SIS, and is telling him, it's very difficult to actually insert an agent into a denied area today with a legend that you've built for them. It's much easier to take a real person in real life and reverse engineer them into being an agent because they already have natural cover. So I'm kind of dealing with that question of how you spy today. How do you run non-official cover agents? It's very, very hard to build a legend for somebody that you can't immediately check on Facebook. You can't immediately check on credit check websites. Any amount of stuff is out there about you for the deft internet researcher, just sitting out there as open source intelligence. And so building a legend is hard. It's really hard these days. And I think they're having real problems with it. And that may also explain, I think, why intelligence agencies may be looking for people that they can reverse engineer into being agents rather than training up NOCs, agents that work under non-official cover. I don't know about any of this, of course. It's all based on like speculation and rumor. But I think they really do find it a lot harder to spy today than they once did.
Sure. Well, tell me a little bit about where the idea for Night Heron came from. And I'm especially curious about Peanut, who I think is just a wonderful creation.
Yeah, I mean, there is a kind of creation myth for Night Heron. And that was that I was sitting in the BBC bureau in Beijing one weekend. I was on weekend duty. And I was there by myself, and there was a knock at the door. And there was a little old gentleman outside the door, a Chinese guy carrying a briefcase. And he said he urgently needed to speak to a BBC reporter. And so I kind of took a chance, and there was nothing else going on. So I let him in and sat him down. And he pulled these documents out of his briefcase and tried to get me to accept them. They weren't very secret Chinese documents. They were what was called Neibu documents, which is something like confidential, for official use only level documents, but still things that a foreign journalist very definitely should not have. And so he tried to get me to take them, and I didn't. I took a quick look at them and gave them back. But this guy kept on contacting me over weeks, trying to get me to accept more and more high-level classification stuff. And this isn't uncommon. It happens to journalists quite a lot in authoritarian countries. I'm sure it was a provocation. It was a dangle. It was the Chinese security services trying to see if I would accept secret documents, and was I perhaps an intelligence officer undercover as a journalist. First rule in journalism is do not accept secret documents from people you don't know. It's just a really bad idea. So I didn't accept them, and I gave them back, and I told this guy to go away. And eventually he did, and I never saw him again. But of course, the story kind of lingered in my head, and I wondered, was he actually a walk-in? Was he somebody who was trying to contact British intelligence? What was all that about? And I ended up spinning it into the central element in Night Heron. Night Heron is a story about a freelance journalist in China who makes the terrible mistake of accepting those documents and then passing them to British intelligence. Why? Because he's vain, he's restless, he wants to be the center of his own story. And this journalist, Philip Mangan, goes on to be recruited by British intelligence, essentially as an access agent, as a cutout agent, a minor player in much larger espionage stories. And we follow him through 3 novels, getting generally messed around and ground up by the global intelligence story and the story of espionage on China and China's espionage against the West. So when I was in China, we got little glimpses of the intelligence story, like the larger, really huge intelligence effort that the West directs against China and the effort that China makes against the West. You got little occasional glimpses of it. For example, in, when was it? 2001, a US spy plane collided with a Chinese fighter off the coast of China. The US spy plane, an EP-3 Orion, had to land at a Chinese airport. The crew were, in effect, taken hostage by China. They had to smash up all their equipment, before the Chinese got their hands on it. It was an incredibly dramatic story. And it dominated headlines at the time for several days. But we all of a sudden found ourselves as China correspondents immersed in this electronic and surveillance warfare story about what the US does on a daily basis off the Chinese coast. Huge numbers of spy planes, loitering off the Chinese coast every day, spy submarines, ships dressed up as trawlers, that are actually intelligence gathering ships that are lingering off the Chinese coast. And we suddenly got a look at all that, and there were other instances like that once or twice, defections, spy trials, things like that gave you a little glimpse into this huge spy story that is China in the West. And so that was all grist to the writing as well. And it was all gave me little kind of instances that I could use and mash up in writing the spy novels. And then lastly, you have the wonderful resource that is FBI indictments. I probably shouldn't be telling people this because I felt like it was my ace in the hole when I was writing my spy novels. If you just read the FBI indictments in spy trials in the United States, they are fantastically detailed about how international espionage works. They're absolutely wonderful, and you can get a wealth of information about the kind of contours of contemporary spying from those documents. Have at it, because there's lots and lots of them out there.
Yeah, I had fun looking at, I think it was Robert Hanson's, the letters back and forth that they had between...
Both terrific.
It's just insane.
Resources, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's great stuff.
But all of them right down to even like little minor spy stories, stories like Benjamin Bishop in Hawaii, US colonel. He's a retired colonel who worked at US PACOM as a contractor based in Honolulu. So he was familiar with US military deployments throughout East Asia and had access to top secret information, had a top secret clearance. And he ended up having an affair with this woman who, it turns out, was an operative of Chinese intelligence. Her cover was as a PhD student, and he was seen squiring her around the hotspots of Honolulu, and somebody tipped off the FBI and he was put under surveillance and he got 7 years. Little stories like that, little honey trap stories, full of detail, full of like crucial insights into tradecraft, into actual operational detail. This stuff is invaluable and allows you to get some kind of, admittedly, very partial and probably naive sense of how this world works. But as an outsider, that's all you're ever going to get. We take what we can.
Your lead character, although, I hesitate to call him specifically lead because you do such a great job at creating so many of the various characters that we meet in the trilogy. But Philip, he's, a great reporter, kind of a terrible spy, to be honest, I would say.
But also quite a good spy at the same time.
Right? By the end, I think he kind of figures it out a little bit. But yeah, he's always the underdog, I would say.
Well, he brings a reporter's instincts to his spying. So, his tradecraft is awful. His handlers are always tearing their hair out at his appalling tradecraft. But his instincts are good in as much as he knows how to read people, and he knows how he knows how to ask questions of his agents. His role is as an access agent. He's a dressed up courier in effect, and he's used to reach deep cover or sort of deeply embedded moles inside China. When it's too hard for foreign intelligence agencies to get to them, they use Mangan because he's a reporter, he's on the ground. And if he's very, very careful, he can make contact with people who are deeply embedded inside the Chinese establishment. But the problem is he isn't very, very careful, and he makes terrible mistakes. As people do, spies do make mistakes. This world is not one of James Bond, where everybody's judgment is perfect. It is a ramshackle world peopled by very sketchy individuals whose judgment is often absolutely appalling. And indeed, espionage work relies on appalling judgment, as far as I can make out. It's pretty bad judgment betraying your country. It's pretty bad judgment selling your country's secrets, lying to your wife and your boss, and handing over proprietary material to a foreign intelligence agency. That is not a great idea. And people who do that have deep character flaws. They do it for all sorts of different reasons, but they're often very flawed people. And espionage depends on that. It depends on dealing with wackos and narcissists. And Mangan's good at doing that. As a reporter, he's deft, he's adaptable, he's seen quite a lot already. He's not fazed by difficult, strange people and situations where you need to improvise and ask questions and make judgments quickly. So all that is good for his tradecraft. And his handler, Val Hopko, recognizes that in him and uses it ruthlessly. She is utterly willing to use him as an expendable individual. And indeed, when I've spoke to people who've been in the business, they would tell me that idea, the idea of the expendable access agent, the expendable courier, is one that does sort of consist in real life espionage. They are happy to use people up like that and then throw them away. One just has to look at a story like that of Greville Wynne, the guy who was initially the courier for Penkovsky, to see that. And there are plenty of other stories like that too. So I was drawing on that idea that espionage agencies are quite happy to use people like that and chuck them away. They say they don't. They always say, oh no, we're incredibly principled and we're jolly good chaps and we look after all our people, and we'd never do that. It's absolute rubbish. They absolutely do.
Well, and that plays to the tension that we see throughout the book series, because Philip knows that, right? And so he's also playing his own game, not necessarily the game that his handlers want him to, right? It always feels to me like he's kind of satisfying his own ego. I mean, he's a vain man, and he has a streak of vanity that I found was quite common in journalism. Journalists always sort of, there's a kind of journalist who always feels like if he was the protagonist, the real player, the power player, he'd do it so much better than the players themselves. That reporters who can't stand just being reporters, actually they want to be in the game. They want to be the protagonists of the game. And journalism tends to attract rather egotistical, slightly narcissistic people, especially broadcast journalism, people who just want to be on TV and want to be famous. There's a lot of those guys in the business. And so I think I injected Mangan with a little bit of that. He wants to be the star of his own story. Just a bit too much. And he doesn't quite understand that about himself. But he's also genuinely fascinated by the workings of power. And he wants to know how power really works. And how does the power work that you can't see? How does the national security sublime actually function? What really happens in those buildings with those hundreds of billions of dollars a year that get spent? What do these people do? Who are they? How does it affect all of us? How do we live our lives in the shadow of these vast, closed, dark agencies that seem to run big chunks of the world, and we don't really know what they do? That question drives him too. Yeah. One of the things I think you do well, especially in Night Heron, is kind of pinpoint that feeling of dislocation, and that just comes from being an outsider. And I got that from your book, which I appreciated.
Yeah, that feeling of, it's sort of hard to get your arms around it and pin it down. The thing about contemporary China is that it has changed incredibly quickly. The psychological and emotional and physical distance that Chinese people have come in the last 30 years is really hard to conceive of. I mean, if you and I feel like our lives have been upended by technology, and everyone feels like technology is moving incredibly quickly here in America, multiply that feeling by 20 if you live in East Asia, and particularly in China. I first went to China in 1983. There were no cars. Everybody wore green and blue, what we call Mao suits, what they call Zhongshanzhuang, but we call Mao suits. You couldn't buy anything in the stores. There was a different currency for foreigners than there was for Chinese people. If you were a Chinese person, you couldn't choose your job. You were told what your job was going to be. You couldn't really decide where you were going to live. You couldn't move from one city to another. You were assigned to a work unit for the rest of your life. If you wanted to marry, you had to get the permission of the Communist Party. They've gone from that to this extraordinary, weird, freewheeling capitalism, massive wealth inequality that dwarfs the wealth inequality you see here in the States. A deep resurgence of a class system, a hugely contemptuous and hyperactive class system, and technology that has infiltrated every area of your life in China. You can't pay with cash anymore in China. Your every payment is tracked on your phone. There are cameras on literally every street corner. Under Xi Jinping these days, if you are a government employee, you must spend several hours a week on your phone answering questions, doing questionnaires about Xi Jinping thought and Communist Party policy. And the app on your phone that you are using to answer these questions is tracking the amount of time you spend doing it. And if you don't spend enough time doing it, you get penalized at work. It goes to the party. So teachers and government officials and employees come home in the evenings now in China and have to pick up their phone, open this special ideology app, and then spend hours writing little essays and answering questions while they're being tracked by the party to see how long they spend doing it. If you are an academic in a university these days, I'm told one day in every 2 weeks, you give over to going and sitting down and spending your day in ideology classes, studying Xi Jinping thought. This is, a weird combination of highly authoritarian politics, ideology, and yet at the same time, this strange, freewheeling, exploitative capitalism in this weird kind of witch's brew of dislocation and kind of bewilderment. Most people don't know what's going on, is my sense about contemporary China. And I should say, I haven't been back to China in several years. It's very difficult for me to go now to get a visa. But just looking at it from the outside and talking to people who do go regularly, the sense of dislocation and then add COVID to that, add zero COVID policies in China, where you can't leave your building without a particular QR code on your phone. If you haven't been tested sufficiently, if you haven't done your daily COVID test, your phone won't give you the right access codes to leave your building or enter a store or go into a theater or get on a bus. It's absolutely extraordinary, these methods of control now. So yeah, this sense of dislocation and alienation, understanding your place in contemporary Chinese society, I think is becoming extremely difficult. Yeah.
So one of the things that a lot of readers have commented to me is how they appreciated your take on the female characters in your books. And you've created some really interesting ones. You've got Pearl, a college student. You've got various SIS members that I think are really interesting characters and characters that you don't see necessarily in a lot of modern espionage fiction. I was wondering what drove you there, other than obviously creating interesting people for folks to read about.
It really was just that. When you write a piece of commercial fiction, you're always trying to find a way of making it stand out from other works of commercial fiction. So much gets published that it's very difficult for a writer to kind of break through. So you're looking for ways of doing this. And obviously writing about China was one way of trying to stand out a bit, because there are so few attempts at writing about China, as we were saying. But also there are so few good female characters in espionage. There's some really good female characters in crime, but not so much in espionage. And so I guess I just thought, that's a little gap there that one could try to fill. And there are some great characters, female characters in real life in espionage. My character, Val Hopko, who is the kind of SIS boss throughout the 3 books, owes something, I think, to the real life SIS spy Daphne Park, who was perhaps the first woman in British intelligence to really make her mark back in the 50s and 60s. Absolutely remarkable spy, amazing woman. And if you read her biography, you'll see where aspects of Val Hopko come from, I think. So those people are out there. One of the people who helped me write the novels and get a sense of how to write them was a former SIS officer who was a woman. So she was very insistent with me that you should be thinking about your female characters. So I did. So I thought hard about them, and yeah, the two principal SIS officers are both women, Val Hopko and her offsider Trish Patterson. So those are two of the principal characters that run through all three books.
Well, as we kind of wrap up talking about your espionage trilogy, what was your favorite part of writing these books? What did you really enjoy the most?
I kind of never thought I'd say it. I mean, as somebody who's been writing for a living since my mid-20s as a journalist and then as a commercial author. But I actually really, writing was always a job to me. But through the course of writing these three novels, it sounds like such a cliche, but it really did become much more than that. And by the end of the third novel, I had kind of got to a place with my own routines and my own process, I think, that I took real pleasure. I really started to look forward to the day's writing. And when it happens, when you do kind of get into a place where you've got your own kind of creative mechanisms are beginning to align a bit, even just as a writer of commercial fiction, not as some sort of literary giant, but as a jobbing journeyman commercial writer, which is what I am. When you do a good day's work, it's a very generous occupation. It does just feel great. And I think it was that. I think it was that more than anything else. Doing the research is great fun. Traveling off to places and China and to Thailand and to Suriname and to Ethiopia and all the places that I set these novels in. I did research trips, and that was great fun. But more fun, or fun at a more kind of profound level, was the being by myself locked in a room, figuring out how to do it, and then maybe, hopefully, just a bit occasionally feeling like I was beginning to get it. I was beginning to get the process of how you do it. That was enormously rewarding. It was really, really good fun. And it ceased to feel like work and more like you're actually kind of doing something. Yeah.
That's great. Well, and that it makes me shift to your latest book, Fragile Cargo. First, I just want to say I loved it. It's a thrilling adventure, a history lesson on China's place in World War II, and it's also a tragic story of the personal cost of China's radical reimagining of itself after the war, and that's all wrapped up in one book, and it was just really a great read.
Oh, that's really kind of you to say. Thank you so much. I mean, this is the first non-fiction book that I've written. So it was a big departure. And I was kind of starting all over again, trying to figure out how to write narrative non-fiction. Yeah, it's a book that tells the story of the imperial art collections of China during the Second World War and how a small group of art historians and curators packed up hundreds of thousands of pieces of art and for 16 years moved them all over China, hiding them from the Japanese. So it's a kind of Monuments Men style story, but for China. And as you say, my aim in the book was really to try and introduce you to what happened in China in the Second World War and why don't we talk about it? If you want to understand China today, you've got to understand China in World War II. Just the same as if you want to understand the US or Europe today, you've got to understand what happened at the end of World War II. No different for Asia. Maybe much more so in Asia. The ghosts of World War II are still much more alive in Asia than they are in Europe and America. The aim of the book is to tell you this really great story through the people that did it, using their memoirs and their voices and their real lived experience to tell you what World War II was like in China, but to do it with this extraordinary story of how they saved all this fantastic art. That's the aim. I hope it succeeds. Yeah, you, the reader, will be the judge. But there it is, and it's out in the US in February 23.
How did you learn about this amazing story, and what made you decide to use that as your focal point?
Quite literally, my wife actually heard about the story on a trip to Taiwan and from museum curators, and she's no slouch on Chinese history. And she'd never heard of it before. She'd never heard this incredible story of how the curators packed up all this art and hid it in World War II. And when she came back from the trip, she said to me, "Have you ever heard of this story before?" And I hadn't either. And we quite literally sat down that evening that she got back and Googled it. and we couldn't find any full telling. We found lots of references to the story, and we found plenty of material in Chinese, but we couldn't find anything in English. We found one chapter in one book that talks about it in any detail, published a long time ago, and one academic article. And we both immediately thought, wow, this is a story that's never been told properly in English. And somebody ought to do it because it's a really amazing story. And you can learn all this other stuff about China through reading this story. So that was 10 years ago, believe it or not. It's taken me 10 years to actually get from that point to having the book come out on the market.
Well, in the story, most people are familiar with the European side of the war, but what's happening in China is much, as you said, much less well known, and the details are just brutal as you read about what happened there.
We don't know how many people died as a result of Japan's invasion of China and China's role in World War II, but it's somewhere between 14 and 20 million is the best guess. I mean, it's up there on a scale with the Soviet Union in terms of its brutality, just the huge, epic scale on which the war took place in China. And we don't know about it. It's been totally memory holed in the West. And I think this raises larger questions. It raises much bigger questions about how we remember World War II, how we use it, and how we represent it to ourselves. And my reading around this has led me to think that we've got a rather kind of, it's going to annoy people when I say this, but I think our view of World War II has become rather kind of corrupted. I think we've reduced it to a set of a few heroic narratives. Normandy, the Battle of Britain, island hopping by the US Marines in the Pacific. A few stories that kind of stand in for a much larger and much more complex whole. And we tend to ignore all these other stories. And we focus on Private Ryan and Band of Brothers and any other number of Normandy stories and this mythologized, sentimentalized view of World War II that doesn't do us any favors. I think we're almost kind of lying to ourselves a bit about it. And I think one way of getting around this is to start looking at hidden voices, muted narratives, other people's stories that you don't normally listen to about World War II. And my book, Fragile Cargo, is an attempt to invite you to maybe reconsider a bit how you look back at the Second World War and how you look back at its scope and who was really affected by it and what really happened. Again, that sounds like a huge ambition, but that is a part of what I'm attempting to do in the book. Yeah.
Well, if you don't have ambition, you never get anywhere, right? You have these men who make really their life's work. It becomes their life's work to take care of these treasures. And your book is really a credit to kind of the common person, these regular people plucked out of obscurity a little bit to become part of a greater project. What was it that kept them going to do this with, what must have seemed like the end of the world going on around them?
Great question. These were museum curators and art historians from Beijing who ended up taking this art through the Japanese invasion, through the appalling bombing, every city in China was bombed flat, and taking it via steamship and truck and raft sometimes, and on the backs of porters and by train, thousands of miles across China, and then hiding it in caves and in temples and in, ancestral halls and quiet villages far out in West China. And that journey mirrors a much larger, massive migration of people. About 100 million people moved from the east of China to the west of China, fleeing the Japanese advance in World War II. This is one of the greatest human migrations in history. It's an absolutely epic story. The government moved, universities moved, whole factories packed themselves up, put themselves on trains and moved. Weapons manufacturers moved to the west of China. It's an astonishing story. And that experience of being a refugee in World War II in China is absolutely engraved on the minds of a generation of Chinese people. Whenever you meet a Chinese American, ask them about it, and they will have stories from their parents and their grandparents and their uncles and their cousins about that time. It's in every Chinese mythology, family mythology. It's all there, living in the memory and lived experience of Chinese people in China and in the entire Chinese diaspora. So my guys in my book went through that whole process, but they sort of didn't do it as refugees. They did it because they had this purpose, that this job. They'd been entrusted with 250,000 pieces of the most valuable, irreplaceable art. The kind of flower of an entire civilization, if you like. And I think that's what kept them going in this appalling time where they're making decisions based on nothing. They're improvising, they're making snap judgments. Everything they do is difficult. Nothing is easy. They haven't got enough money. They haven't got enough food. The cases in which the art is stored are being dropped and smashed and getting wet and getting lost. And, everything goes wrong all the time. And they just stay with it, I think, because they are people who had a very, very deeply ingrained sense of duty. And they're museum curators who just can't stand to see the art get lost or broken. They have to conserve it. They are natural conservators. And they also are very strong, resilient, thoughtful people. The lesser curators, the guys who couldn't handle it, all fall away. They all go home. They all run away. They can't do it. The guys who stuck with it were extraordinary individuals. And the memoirs that they wrote kind of show you how extraordinary they were. They were remarkably tough guys. And I hope the book draws out a little bit of who they were and how they functioned in the appalling circumstances that they did. One of the guys I write about is called Na Zhiliang, and he writes endlessly about, in his memoirs, just about how much he hates being on the road because of the bed bugs. Wherever he goes, there are bed bugs. Every hotel, every hostel they stay in, he wakes up just every day covered in bug bites, and he just hates it. And this is a sort of enduring theme throughout the entire book, as they're constantly wrestling with not only bed bugs, but termites and moths and bugs that attack the art all the time. They're constantly, there's this constant battle against insects, which wasn't something I was expecting to find when I started researching the book, but it's a big theme of their lived experience at the time. So little bits of texture like that help bring the whole story alive, I hope.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and I was wondering about your research process on this, because you do get to know these guys in a way that I wasn't expecting. And also just the details of the journey. I mean, some of the things that you find and know about what they went through is pretty extraordinary.
All of that really comes from the memoir and from 2 interviews that I did with surviving eyewitnesses, very, very elderly gentlemen in Taiwan who remembered the process. So I got quite a bit of texture from them. But a lot of it is just this beautiful memoir these guys wrote. Na Zhiliang particularly just gives great texture. He keeps telling you about what he's eating. He's obsessed with food. He's constantly telling you about, oh yeah, and we stopped in this place and it was pouring with rain and there was Japanese bombing and I had to unload 7,000 cases of art. But then they had this great braised carp with soy and ginger and scallions, and it was great. And the local booze is fantastic, and we all got really drunk. You get all this great personalized stuff. And he gives this great description of life in wartime China, where he tells you about all the markets, and he gives you the names of the cafes that he used to frequent. And you really get a feel for who the guy was and what mattered to him. And that was a very gratifying process. Listening for that voice and then kind of trying to hear it and then render it in English was a really gratifying process. And he was very good for that, because he was so open and he was so generous with himself in his writing and in his memoir. One interesting thing I discovered about all this, we were talking about journalism a little while ago. We were talking about all the opinion journalism that we get these days, where journalists have become opinion writers a lot of the time. Looking back, doing research on something that happened 80 years ago, 90 years ago, I did a lot of reading of contemporary newspaper accounts, some in Chinese and a lot in English, and a lot of reading of memoir and a lot of journalistic reportage style writing of the time, particularly Western journalists who were in China. And a lot of these guys, particularly when they spent some time in China, they go home, they write a book. They do a lot of writing about the detail of the time, but then they start doing opinion writing. They start telling you their analysis of the period in China, and they start telling you what it all means. And the stuff that is least interesting in all those books is their analysis and opinion writing. The stuff that's really useful is the straight reporting. It's when a reporter just tells you, I was at the docks today in Nanjing and we were bombed by 27 G3M bombers of the Japanese Navy, and this is what happened. That stuff is invaluable, a straight reporting. Then when they start talking about oh, and Chinese politics is this, and this is the nature of the Chinese race, and this is how the Chinese behave. That stuff is completely useless. It's of no value at all. So as a former reporter, I really took away a lesson from that, which is that straight reporting is what is going to live for posterity. And all your opinion writing is not going to matter 5, 10, 20, 30 years from now. Keep that in mind as a journalist as you go.
That's great. With shifting from fiction, where the possibilities are as big as your imagination, to nonfiction, where you have some very clear lines drawn, a hard change for you, or did you appreciate it more, or was it just a different experience?
Oh, it's just a very different experience. I mean, in some ways, it felt like returning to journalism a bit, in that you're working with sources and you're writing to, they call an external reference. There is a truth out there that you are trying to capture and portray. And you're working with all this external stuff, interviewing people, looking at memoirs, looking at histories. Whereas with fiction writing, it's all coming out from the inside of your head, really. All the research that you do in fiction writing is totally secondary to actually constructing the machinery of the novel and making the machinery of the novel work. Character, plot, voice, conflict, structure. That's what really matters in writing the novel, is what's going on in your head. With nonfiction, it felt much more like kind of assembling a thing, making a thing that's external to me. Yeah, it was a great process for me, and a great learning process, discovering how to do that. Again, how successful I've been at doing it is another matter, but the process of trying to figure out how to do it was great and very different.
So what's next for you? What are you working on now?
I don't know. I'm sitting around twiddling my thumbs trying to find a new project, and half of me wants to go back and write another novel, and half of me wants to build on all the work that I did with this narrative nonfiction and write another piece of nonfiction, perhaps about China in World War II again, if I could find the right story. Part of me says if I was actually an industrious and committed writer, I would do both. But I haven't yet figured out what it's going to be. Part of me would like to try something that isn't to do with China. Part of me says, no, that's what I know about, and that's what I should write about. So I'm a bit stuck with all these questions at the moment. But no doubt something will turn up. Something has to turn up.
Well, I, for one, would be very happy if you return to espionage fiction, but based on your nonfiction debut, I think you got a good start there as well. So I just will look forward to whatever you come up with next.
You're really kind. Thank you very much, Jeff. It's very encouraging and sort of validating to hear that. I appreciate it a lot.
Adam, thanks so much for joining me today. If people want to follow your work, what's the best way to do that?
Website, www.adambrooks.com, and I'm on Twitter at Adam Brookes Word. Google it. I'm not hard to find.
Okay. Well, I'll have links to all of that in the show notes, and you can find that all there. That's going to wrap up this episode. If you have suggestions for future shows or future things that we should cover, please drop me a comment in the Spybrary Facebook group, or you can send me a line right at Spywrite on Twitter. Do you enjoy the show? If so, please consider taking 2 seconds and leave a review in Apple Podcasts, Good Pods, Podchaser, any of your listening apps. We'll have links to all the stuff discussed today in the podcast show notes. Until next time, thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to the Spybrary podcast. You don't have to wait for the next episode. Join the conversation happening now at facebook.com/Spybrary and on Twitter @Spybrary.